Hey, I want to speak about a very, very important issue that's very, very prevalent in the world today and is very contentious, but just because the subject is contentious doesn't mean it shouldn't be spoken about. And so long as I have breath in my body and I live in a country that, for now at least, values freedom of expression, I am going to speak out. I want to talk about the massive amount of intolerance that exists in Islamic majority countries. Now, often in videos like this, I make a disclaimer, but to be quite honest, if you're not prepared to listen to what I have to say and you're just going to jump to conclusions, it's not my problem. Um, if you do have the patience to watch the end of the video, thank you for that in advance, because I am going to cover a lot of important issues here, and it's very, very important. I want to talk about a recent event just as a case example of what I'm talking about, and sadly, this is one of many, but it is just the most recent notable case example. So a few days ago, there was a young man in Yemen. I believe he was only 16. Omar Mohammed Betawil. He was reportedly kidnapped from his home in the Greater District of Aden and killed by a group of Islamists. Now, social media reports suggest that he was killed because he was an atheist and because he had written supposedly atheist blogs and criticized harsh interpretations of Islam. Now, it has to be said that his family have robustly denied that he's an atheist. Whether that is the case, or whether they're frightened for themselves, it's hard to tell. But either way, the fact that this young man has been brutally murdered simply for expressing his opinions is utterly barbaric. Utterly barbaric. Now, the situation is, and just to cite another recent example, there was a Palestinian poet in Saudi Arabia who was sentenced to 800 lashes and 8 years in prison that had been commuted from the death penalty. Frankly, the death penalty sounds the lesser of two evils in this case. 800 lashes. I mean, if he doesn't die from blood loss, then I don't know how anyone could survive that anyway. It reminds me of the old days in Britain when people were put in the pillory and would die from the punishment that they would receive. But we're talking about Saudi Arabia in the 21st century, where it's the case the example I've just used is Britain in the 18th century. Um, Without question, there is a massive, massive problem in the Islamic world, for want of a better term, with extreme interpretations of Islamic law. This is without question. Human rights abuses are absolutely rampant, and there is a massive and very deeply entrenched level of intolerance to both non believers and perceived minority sects or apostates. In 5 countries, the crime for so called apostate is death, and the countries are Sudan, Yemen, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia. And on numerous occasions, the death penalty has been carried out, though not in every case. Often it does result in a commute of the sentence. Now, to the Islamist factions in these societies, that isn't enough. They believe that their governments are being too soft. That's mind-boggling to me. That there are people who actually believe the likes of the Saudi government is too soft. So the poisonous thinking that these people have, the medieval backward mindset that these people have, isn't just a few individuals. This is actually held by millions of people. And that might well be a contentious statement, but it is the plain, solid truth. That is not to say that every Muslim is an extremist. Now, this is a very, very important point with this, because whenever critics of Islam raise these facts, there's always a predictable one liner from a lot of Muslims online that pretty much goes along these lines. Oh, Islam is peace. Muslims are peaceful. You're an Islamophobe. You hate Islam. You're uneducated. You need to educate yourself about Islam, etc., etc., etc. But you don't even have to be a Quranic scholar to see the basic facts here. You don't have to have read the Quran from cover to cover to see what is happening in Islamic countries. And it is nothing short of barbaric. Um, it's not exactly the same from country to country, it does vary. So, for instance, Indonesia and Malaysia are a lot more moderate comparatively speaking. And I think one reason for that is it would be wrong to describe them as secular societies, but they have been careful not to label themselves as strictly Islamic republics, although they are majority Islamic countries, especially Indonesia. In fact, as far as I understand it, the only part of Indonesia that has a strict interpretation of Sharia is the Aceh province. That's the only part of the whole country. That's why Indonesia is a relatively, in terms of Islamic society, is a relatively liberal society, relatively speaking. It's not Pakistan, it's not Saudi Arabia. Although that doesn't mean that there isn't always a chance of that happening, and Indonesia and other relatively moderate countries can't be complacent. But the fact of the matter is, there's not a single Islamic country that I can think of that doesn't have some level of intolerance, deep intolerance, either within the society or within legislation. In Pakistan, there is legislation in place dealing with hate crime, dealing with supposedly protecting minorities, but either the law is simply not enforced enough, or the government basically is dealing with a problem that is beyond its hands because the pervading brainwash mentality in a large segment of the society is such that it really is beyond their hands. Islamism is basically like a cult, it brainwashes people. And if you look at the situation in Pakistan with the supporters of the killer Mumtaz Qadri, um, these people are not all uneducated peasants. Some of these people are educated people. They're lawyers, they are professional people in some cases, and I know that because I've been in debates with them and I've checked out some of their background. So they can't just plead ignorance. This is a problem that comes from a poisoning of the mind, and I am adamant that this is what religion does. Now, one thing about many of these people is they will say something like, "Oh, we condemn ISIS. ISIS are terrible terrorists," or they'll condemn, for example, the atrocity in Lahore. But that's a very, very easy thing to do because the whole world can see how barbarous that is. But individual incidents of barbarism are less reported because they are individual incidents. So this case I mentioned about this young guy in Yemen, that's not going to be world news in the way that the Hor bombing was. And the reason for that is because it is so widespread. So it would be impossible to report every single case. Um, and there is a massive, massive hypocrisy amongst many conservative Muslims out there because, on one hand, they will say, "Oh, we abhor terrorism, we condemn ISIS, they're not real Muslims." But the very same people would go on to condone stoning and go on to justify the murder of apostates. So, on one hand, they claim that they're opposed to terrorism. On the other hand, they're actually justifying individual acts of personal terror against individuals. And I am fed up with the hypocrisy because so often, for socially conservative Muslims who live in the West, they're the very first to yell about victimhood and how they're supposedly under attack all the time by the wicked Western media and how awful it all is being a Muslim in the West. Here's the thing, it is true that there have been individual anti Muslim hate crimes. That is true. And in the United States, there have been attacks on Sikhs who have been mistaken for Muslims. Now, aside from the fact that there is very strict legislation in place dealing with hate crime, the main issue here is that the wider population in Western societies does not condone this. They just don't. You may get support for far right parties, but that support is still mainly on the fringe. So, for example, in the UK, Britain First remains a controversial organisation. It can hardly be called a mainstream organisation. It has a lot of support, I grant that, but I also think This is just a side effect of a perception that governments are being too soft on radical Islam and not calling a spade a spade. So that's why people go to groups like Britain First. Now, just a quick word about that, because there are a few Britain First people have come onto my videos thinking that I'm like minded. I want to be very clear about this. The reason I don't endorse Britain First is because I believe their tactics are just counterproductive. So going into a mosque and throwing your weight around and harassing elderly imams is not the way to take on Islamism. It's just not. I understand the anger and I understand that there is absolutely a threat out there, but that is not the way to do it. And frankly, Britain First has a serious image problem because they act like a bunch of rowdy football casuals. That's the perception. You can say that's misguided, but perception is extremely important if you are a campaign group or you are a quasi political party. Um, but with this being said, with an acknowledgement that there is examples of individual anti-Muslim bigotry in the West, there's absolutely no moral equivalency whatsoever for the situation for Muslims in the West versus the situation for non-Muslims in countries like Saudi Arabia, where you can be executed if you're an atheist. So there's zero moral equivalency to this. And I do think left wingers in the West, frankly, need to waken up. Um, when right wing figures say things like individual mosques should be probed, instead of jumping on a bandwagon saying, oh, they're a fascist, actually examine that a little bit. I personally don't have a problem with individual mosques. I'm not talking about standard policy, I'm talking about individual mosques that have had a track record of hate preachers being scrutinised. That is common sense. Because when the Brussels attacks happened, what happened there was for months on end, Molenbeek, the neighbourhood where a lot of the bombers came from, or the attackers came from, had essentially been ignored because the police were too reluctant to go in there. And that's not a conspiracy theory, that's the admission of the Belgian authorities themselves. So I really get fed up with the total hypocrisy that is at stake here. And I think that Western leaders need to be a lot more robust and come out and condemning this. So liberals like Mr. Trudeau in Canada and Mr. Obama need to be a lot more outspoken on this if they truly are liberal. And although I'm broadly speaking a supporter of President Obama, this is one of my main disappointments about his presidency. I think he could be a lot more vocal on specifically radical political Islamism. Now, when Mr. Obama speaks, it's always in the context of terrorism. He never calls it what it is. And this is one of the very few areas I do agree with Ted Cruz on. I'm no fan of Ted Cruz. In fact, I think Ted Cruz, if he had his way, would want a Christian theocracy, which is like, choosing between Satan and the devil. But I think that he has a point about that. President Obama will not call a spade when it comes to radical Islamic terrorism. And frankly, I get sick and tired of some Muslims in the West constantly being defensive and constantly assuming this victimhood mentality. Drop it. Just drop it. If you have personally been a victim of a hate crime, for example, if you're a Muslim woman and you've had your hijab ripped off, I unreservedly condemn that. And you have every right to be angry with the person who done it. Likewise, if you're a Muslim man and you've had to put up with verbal abuse and so on, again, I utterly condemn that. No one should have to put up with that. But that does not mean that there is institutional state level persecution against Muslims. And people who suggest that Muslims are the new Jews in the West do not know what the hell they are talking about. It's just utter nonsense. Utter nonsense. There's simply no moral equivalency between the situation of Muslims in Western Europe in 2016 to, for example, Jews in 1930s Germany. Jews in 1930s Germany couldn't own property, they had to mark themselves as Jews. The list goes on and on and on. There's absolutely no moral equivalency whatsoever. And I am so tired of those who assume this victimhood mentality, not only because it's dishonest, but also because it makes actually debating these very important issues next to impossible. Because they'll constantly be talking from a defensive mentality. Um, I think one fundamental difference is, people will say, well, there are Christian extremists as well, there's Hindu extremists, there's Buddhist extremists. It is absolutely true that you get Christian fanatics. I'm well aware of that. You get the likes of the Westboro Baptist Church and you get other extreme fundamentalists. I understand that. The difference is Christianity has evolved to a point where there is at least a scope for debate within Christianity, and generally speaking, moderate Christians do not face violence or murder for speaking out against the extremists. Whereas, by contrast, moderate Muslims, by which I mean Muslims who don't believe that infidels and gay people should be executed, um, and there's a lot of other ways that that can be defined, but they actually do face threats from extreme conservative Muslims, and they're deemed to be not real Muslims and so on and so forth. So actually, although Islam is a pluralistic religion, it is. This is a very important point. There's many different sects and branches and schools of thought. Even with that in mind, within Islamic countries, there's very, very little scope for tolerant civil discourse because this notion of blasphemy and apostasy is so deeply entrenched that it's basically something akin to the situation that England was in the 16th century between the Catholic Protestant schism and, as we called it, the Marian persecutions when Queen Mary, who was a Catholic, sent many Protestants to the stake, and many Catholics were martyred as well under Protestant monarchs. I honestly believe that the Islamic world is facing a serious, serious internal crisis of intolerance. The attacks against Christians and other minority groups are well documented. What is this discussed actually is the extremism and the intolerance of Muslim minority sects like the Ahmadis and the Sufis, which is just as rampant. Um, I mean, let's say for the sake of argument, even if this young guy in Yemen wasn't an atheist and he was actually a liberal Muslim, that only proves my point. So this is a situation that is absolutely massive. It is abundant and it stretches all the way from North Africa to Pakistan and it's slowly encroaching now in Bangladesh. Um, Far too many academics, I don't know what the figure is at this stage, but there have been a lot of academics and scholars in recent years who have been literally brutally murdered on the streets. Now, to be fair, there is a large contingent of Bangladeshi Muslims who condemn this and who actively protest against it. But there is an Islamist incursion in Bangladesh, and if Bangladesh continues going down this dark path, it will end up like Pakistan. Um, I think it's still not quite at that stage, but it's heading there. And by the way, to any Pakistani viewers, I'm not generalizing 180 million people. Obviously, Islamists don't represent all Pakistanis, but my point is Pakistan is a deeply, deeply conservative society. I don't think anyone could dispute that. And yes, it varies from area to area. So Karachi would be a bit more cosmopolitan. But my point is this pervading mentality, it doesn't matter if you abhor ISIS or you abhor the Taliban even, but then you go on to think it's perfectly okay for homosexuals to be killed or for women who have been accused of dishonoring their family because they have been victims of rape to be stoned to death. If this is your mentality, then you are an extremist. And I am of the view that this illness, this virus of Islamist thinking, is the predominant thing that holds these countries back. Because where there are wealthy Islamic countries, the only reason is because of the natural resources. It's not because they have used enlightenment and education and debate to get to that point in science. Iran is an interesting example. It's a bit more complex because actually in Tehran, for example, there's quite a strong liberal contingent or, you know, let's say moderate cosmopolitan contingent. So Iran, I think, is a very interesting example. Personally, I think Iran is more advanced than Saudi Arabia in this regard. Um, but that doesn't mean Iran doesn't have its problems. Obviously, it does have severe problems. Um, I just find it baffling that we live in a world where people can literally be stoned to death in the name of religion. So if you're saying Islam is peace, Islam is perfect, you're lying. It's as simple as that. If that is the case, if there is a utopian Islam, and actually I would say that all religions have that sort of utopian message, but it totally disregards the human factor. And every present example of an Islamic state or a state governed by Islamic law or a state that has a large Islamist influence is rampant with human rights abuses. These are facts. And in my opinion, Western leaders need to be assertive. I'm aware that there is trade issues, but if Western leaders can't have the backbone to vocally condemn some of the things that are going on, especially amongst their so-called allies, then what is the point of having liberal values at all? Or not even liberal, libertarian values. Values based on liberty, values based on the rule of law, values based on free expression. What is the point of having any of these things if we are not prepared to speak out? So, my message to Muslims in the West is I don't hate you, and I wish you all the best, continue practicing your religion, etc., etc. But you need to understand that there is no moral equivalency between the situation here and the situation in Islamic countries. And if you're spending all your time wallowing in victimhood whilst ignoring what is going on in countries like Pakistan and Yemen, then you're just a rank hypocrite.